thank you for joining us. As I said earlier, you're in Poland at the moment. You're teaching in the UK, though. I
Yes.
caught up with some of your writings on The Conversation. Now, we have a conversation in New Zealand. This is not the New Zealand version of it. I was doing some looking around for the Gary Lineker story, and your article came up talking about the BBC and how they're struggling to adapt to the social media age. Obviously, BBC, biggest public broadcaster in the world, I believe. And obviously, social media, it is a brand new world, and these public entities are needing to come across how to deal with that, especially with their personalities. So why don't you just kick us off by maybe expanding on your title, expanding on your story, and explain maybe why and how. And for people to know, you worked for the BBC for like 20 years?
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Yeah. So you know it from the inside out, and now you're working as an academic and a lecturer in this world as well.
Yes. So
what's going on at the BBC around social media and their personalities?
Okay, I wish I knew, because I'm no longer an insider, and having been there for more than 2 decades gives me a limited mandate to talk about it. With reference to the title, that's not my title. Obviously, it went through the editing process and got more tamed in its formulation. So I wouldn't say that the BBC struggles with social media. It's got its own specific take on how social media combines with its mission and activities. And I think we should also give credit to the BBC for a few things. They were really one of the first broadcasters to embrace the world of the internet with reference to news. So with virtually no budget, they developed bbcnews.com and became the most visited news website. So there was a lot of kind of a visionary foresight on the part of people who were in the know rather than the BBC managers. Unfortunately, the BBC is run by the managers, and they often make some kinds of mistakes. And with reference to social media, they have pretty advanced and informed approach to new media and their core legacy activities. But in this case, I think we're dealing with a combination of a couple of factors. One, which I would call the class system within the BBC itself in reference to its staff and contributors. And the second is the residual belief that the BBC is still the dog and not the tail. And unfortunately, I think the reality, particularly with the younger generation, is that it's the other way around. Young people know about the BBC from their news feeds and streams rather than from direct consumption of the BBC as a broadcaster. A lot of my students do not consume any scheduled or linear broadcasts. They don't even know what the mission, the philosophy and the ethos of the BBC is. If they do, they know it indirectly, secondhand. The same goes for the news. So they don't even identify the original sources being the BBC. It's simply slightly amorphous news item or talking point knocking about on social media. So I think the BBC still thinks that is important in the same way as it was 2 decades ago. It's not the case. It should see itself more as an influencer in a big way. And even though it's got a mandate, a charter, and we're dealing with the situations which has been described by the Conservative Party Deputy Chairman, Lee Anderson, only a couple of days ago. Lineker has become bigger than the BBC. And I think it encapsulates the situation where a single person or personality basically acts and performs the role of a micro or mini media organization. And that created this quite significant problem, which may seem trivial from the distance, but actually is key to the more important question about how you shape public opinion and conduct public discourse on social media.
Yeah, as you describe it as a micro media entity, I think in your article you talk about how someone on a social media platform can have a massive audience. So there are some singular individual people that have far bigger audiences, some entire media entities. And I'm intrigued by you describing them or suggesting that they should treat themselves like an influencer. That word has such, I think, negative connotations to quote unquote serious news people. Influencers seem to be frivolous and something on Instagram that sells, products to help beauty products and that kind of stuff. But I guess what I hear you saying is the influencer, the thing that an influencer does is influence, and that's what the news
Yes.
can do, and maybe change the way they're thinking about what they're doing. I'm not saying not being hard news, because I don't like infotainment, when it comes to news and stuff myself. It's important that we have factual, unbiased news as well. But to maybe deliver it in a different way, deliver it more like an influencer would, not necessarily in like your leggings and having your butt out, but in a
Yes.
style that they would with as a way that the younger generation, the next generation, will receive it better. Is that sort of what you're saying about consider
Well,
themselves to be influencers?
I think that when divorced from the internet and social media environment, the word influence is totally positive, or
Yeah, yeah,
has got the right meaning. It's often that you, against the context of the virtual world, words and terms and definitions change. And here we talk about influencing, it's shaping the public opinion. If you
yeah,
say the BBC shapes the public opinion, everybody's so happy about it. That's what it should do. Do it with a certain ethos and values and standards of impartiality, accuracy, and all that stuff. But when you embed it into the internet environment, it suddenly becomes a negative thing. And this is the thing that a lot of things, when they receive an iteration or formulation within the virtual world, they are disfigured, distorted, and almost become a caricature of things. So we have a situation when a football pundit, because essentially speaking, Gary Lineker is a football pundit,
yeah,
when he makes an utterance of a political nature, and it reverberates in a completely disproportional way, purely because he's got millions of followers who have who follow his Twitter account. And although he's got a limited knowledge, and he's very badly informed politically, although there is a caveat to it,
yeah.
he is communicating with millions of people who are sport fans and supporters, or football supporters, and their exposure to news is very limited. It's very
Yeah,
often
yeah,
through the prism of football.
yeah.
So how can they relate to public discourse in politics and culture? They do it through the prism and in the context of sport, which can be really quite harmful. And this is what happened. What is interesting is that few people have actually bothered to analyze how and what Lineker said in his tweet. And
Which I think we should do, Marek. So why don't we put it up? This is from your the conversation piece. This is what Gary Lineker said. There is no huge influx. This is talking about migrants coming to the UK, and I think they call it the small boat policy or something like that.
that's
I think as well, actually, and I'm not sure if this is in your article. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the UN has actually criticised this policy as well. But so this is what Gary Lineker did. There's no huge influx. We take far fewer refugees in other major European countries. This is just an immense, cruel policy directed at the most vulnerable people in language that is not dissimilar to that used by Germany in the 30s. And I'm out of order? Question mark. Now, the media in the UK then took the reference to Germany in the 30s, and the headlines were Gary Lineker's Nazi tweet. Which, I can see why they'd draw that parallel, but it's not exactly what he said, talking about Germany in the 30s. So that's the context of what he said. You're saying people aren't like delving into the information that he's also putting out there. What else do we need to know?
Well, I think there are a few things. Who jumped on that tweet was not exactly, I think, originally the BBC. It was the Conservatives which saw this as completely out of order, because if you kind of read the paraphrastic or oblique formulation by Lineker, not using the offensive words like Nazi or Hitler or anything like that. And what he does, I think that he has been quite disingenuous the way he wrote the tweet, which may seem innocent, but it bypasses the words which usually trigger filtering of such tweets and comments online. Sometimes it's referred to as the Godwin law, which is a way of dealing with offensive content referring to Nazi, Holocaust, and things like that, which pretty much trivializes any debate when you try to roll out that type of criticism against your opponents. So he bypassed that. So he's not as innocent as it may seem, because the formulation is not dissimilar to that of Germany in the 30s, obviously avoids using those words or association which an algorithm would identify as offensive or insulting. So it was a highly political statement. It was targeted at a specific policy, which was a government policy. So strictly speaking, it is definitely not impartial. Now, the question is that as a football pundit, is he free to make political comments within the framework of his contract? And it looks like there were precedents when he escaped scot-free in the past, like last year in September, he said something not exactly similar, but the BBC actually supported him against its own staff, who pointed out, look, Lineker is kind of trespassing on his brief as a football pundit. So we must be aware of the fact that it is a transgression. Now the question is, does it somehow impinge on the freedom of speech? Because, as rightly pointed out, a lot of these people who are so-called freelancers or contributors with the BBC have their own interest and life outside the BBC, and you can't require everybody, a musician, a scientist, whatever, to abide by all the standards and editorial guidelines in their lives and public appearances, statements outside the BBC context. So it's a difficult one.
What's it? Is it though? It seems to me that if you're doing news, if you're in the BBC news department, if you're a journalist, you've probably got those clauses in your contract. If you're anybody else, it's not necessarily as important. I want to play a piece of audio here as well. This is from Sky Sport. The commentator is Kavi Solkol, and one of the points he makes in this commentary as well is he talks about what happens at the BBC, what has happened with other people, up to and including management and very highly rated, very highly ranked management, and their conflicts of interest that never get questioned, other personalities whose statements never get questioned, yet they've pulled out Gary Lineker. Maybe they needed to have a poster child to stop all this happening. But listen to the point that, this is for my people, I'm sure you've heard this, Marek, but listen to the point that this commentator makes about how the BBC's inconsistency seems to be one of the problems here.
How come somebody like Andrew Neil, who for a very, very long time was the BBC's top political broadcaster and interviewer, how come it was okay for him to be the chairman of a right-wing magazine, The Spectator? How come it was okay for him to go on social media and Twitter and display his political opinions on a whole range of matters? How come it's okay for the chairman of the BBC, Richard Sharp, to be somebody who donated £400,000 to the Conservative Party and then went on to play a role in arranging an £800,000 loan for Boris Johnson? Why is it okay for Robbie Gibb, or as we're supposed to call him, Sir Robbie Gibb, to be on the BBC board when he was a director of communications for the former Prime Minister, Theresa May? Why is it okay for Alan Sugar, another high-profile figure on the BBC, to say what he thinks about political matters on Twitter? Why is it okay for Tim Davie, who's the Director General of the BBC, the Director General? He used to be the Deputy Chairman of the Hammersmith and Fulham Conservative Party. He stood in local elections as a Conservative candidate. How come Jeremy Clarkson, who used to be on the BBC, why was he allowed to have a column in The Sun and the Sunday Times and on social media frequently made political comments which a lot of people thought were extreme? This is what people are thinking. Why have all these people been allowed to effectively do and say what they want, but Gary Lineker is not allowed to make a comment about a government policy which has been condemned by the United Nations and many human rights groups?
There you go. So there's the question of consistency, I guess, as well, Marek. Or yeah. So what is your response to the point being made?
Well,
by
here
the
we
pundit
enter
there?
the murky world of BBC boardrooms and the issues of class and establishment. And all these people listed by the presenter reflect the stratification in terms of what they can do or what they can't. I mean, just to give you a very trivial example, as BBC staff, I started to write for an outside publication that was spotted by my line manager, who immediately approached me and reproached me, while I said, look, my other colleagues are writing for a plethora of other outside publications and broadcasters, and they don't seem to have a problem. Yes, but it's complicated, Marek. You have to approach us and get clearance for that. So everybody got very different treatments. It all depended on the pecking order and their position in the food chain. So the top people have much more leeway and a much wider range of freedom. But having said that, it's also a question of responsibility. A person like Andrew Neil knows how to behave within his role with the BBC, and so he will not push or promote his points of view or positions when he acts in a different capacity. So these are all these nuances which are sometimes difficult to capture in terms of contractual obligations and proper behavior or due diligence. I think it's all down in the devil is in the detail, and we have no insight into the, formulation or wording of the contracts. And I think the BBC as an arbiter here appears to be arbitrary. They refer to the contracts. The issue with Lineker is probably that he started being more and more active politically, and it raised eyebrows. And I think that there was a knee-jerk reaction on the part of the BBC when they were attacked by the Conservatives. So they acted impetuously rather than talking to Lineker first, say, look, we raised you from a baby to a highest paying commentator, because, when he came to do commentary, he wasn't great. And the BBC has got this unspoken or unarticulated proviso that we can make anyone into a star. And I've seen that, the so-called accelerated career paths, where somebody who's been anointed to be a star is given a lot of training and investment to perform very well on air and to become a public figure and a celebrity. So they did invest in him a lot of money and made him into a great commentator. He's their baby, he's their product.
Yeah.
So
it's
he
really
should
interesting.
behave. And because he had outgrown his initial kind of persona, he started to go into politics. Even some people were saying that, he's become a spokesman for the Labour Party. And, I think it's a question of not what is written and it's the gentleman's agreement. And I think that essentially it's about the fact that he has transgressed that kind of gentleman's agreement, and he
Right.
started to act against the best interests of the BBC, who genuinely tried to do a very hard balancing act in their precarious position, given the funding issues, the changing media environment, digitization, and all that.
Well, look, I think the other thing is, in the end, I think Gary Lineker wins. I think it was summed up beautifully by author Nick Pettigrew. I don't know if you've seen this, Marek, but on Twitter, this is the tweet that Nick Pettigrew, who's a British author, sent out. He says those BBC negotiations in full. Delete the tweets. No. Okay, well, apologize for them. No. Well, we'll get somebody else to do your job if you don't. And something we haven't talked about is no other presenter would take the job, would step up. So in other words, no one would back the BBC, none of the other presenters. So the response is everyone down stools. Will you promise not to tweet political stuff in the future? No. Okay, we have a deal. And that's kind of the result as to how it's come out. And it's fascinating for me to look at our own public entities here and see how they handle it. TVNZ is a separate entity in New Zealand to RNZ, and they kind of handle the social media world differently. But, this has been, I think, if nothing else, a conversation starter for social media, public media entities, and maybe on some other level, news entities as well. If you're a journalist working at a commercial news entity, like you might want to have some similar rules in place about impartiality. But, Gary Lineker is not in the news world. He's in the football world. He's a pundit. He's not employed by the BBC. I think the BBC went a bit too far here, Marek.
Yes, I agree. And the tweet which you showed, I think it's pretty much what probably happened. But there is some doubt about the last question. Will you not do political stuff in there? He may have said, I'll think about it rather than no. But that's true. The hand of the BBC doesn't extend as far as they wish it would. And that's a very good example. They no longer have the range of influence and say in how public opinion is shaped.
Yeah.
And I think they need to think about their position in the new world and how to ascertain or secure it properly in the new environment. And I think if they still think in terms of those, rigid rules and regulations which could be enforced in the traditional world of media, but you really would need a very new and entirely different framework of operating as a public broadcaster in that environment. And I think that needs to be looked at seriously and creatively.